Thank you very much for that very interesting lecture with the promised provocative ending. Thank you. Caspian, Rehbinder, please give us your thoughts initially, 10 minutes or so, 5-10 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion.
Thank you. I will try to... sorry. I'll try to keep this brief so we can continue with the discussion as soon as possible. So thank you a lot, Professor Weede, and thank you, Goethe-Institut, for inviting me here. I would like to just start by saying that I very much appreciate your lecture, and I agree with most of it. But if there was no disagreement, there would be not much base for discussion. So I'll get straight into some of the points that I think should be elaborated or criticized, or maybe that you're even wrong about. We'll see about that. To start with, I think you talked about globalization in the wrong tense. You say that globalization was something. I would argue that globalization wasn't, it is. If you look at trade between countries, it's as high or higher than it's ever been. If you look at foreign direct investment between countries, which is at least as important as trade, it's not even as big as ever. It's growing from record levels to increasingly record levels. If you look at the globalization also, not only for economic reasons, but of culture, of technology, people consume literature, movies, food, technology that is invented, created, and distributed all over the world. So to say that globalization has been something and not that it is to misrepresent the state of the world. Now, does that, and also the effects of globalization. Now, you don't argue that globalization is bad for the economy, obviously, but I just also want to raise the point of concern that many people are having, that globalization and trade would create fewer jobs and more unemployment and so on. Those are, of course, not true. If you look at, for example, the state of affairs in Europe, there is a discussion to be had about the effects on real wages in the United States, but let's keep to Europe for simplicity's sake. Employment levels in Europe are at all-time high. If you look at shares of the population, wages are at all-time high. Wage growth is not all-time high, but certainly not bad. So there seems to be no adverse effect of this large trade, large foreign direct investment, large economic globalization, and also cultural globalization on work, wages, employment, etc. Does that mean that I see no problems with the state of the world? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So there are a lot of problems, and I think that you sum them up very, very neatly and precisely in the word legitimacy. You talk about the decreasing legitimacy of free trade and of globalization, and I think that's a point that you could have made even stronger. So if we just go back just a few hundred years and talk a bit about the European miracle again, not only the crisis of globalization but also the European miracle. How did that come about? The main reason that I got from your speech is the disunity between European countries. European countries not being these large empires like China, like India, like there are other examples in the world, and that's, I believe that's true to a certain extent. But disunity is not enough to explain the birth of capitalism and the rule of law in Europe specifically. There is a good quick case for disunity being the main difference between, for example, Europe and China. But what about Europe and Africa? Europe and South America? Europe and North America? There are a lot of different takes that you need to make in order to explain Europe. And we come back here to legitimacy, because even if you mentioned Deirdre McCloskey in your speech, I don't think you made her point as strong as you should have. Hers and also Joel Moker's point that ideas matter, culture matters. The birth of capitalism is not only the birth of some institutions and some politics. It's not only something that just happens. It's about the birth of a culture of capitalism, the culture of invention, the culture of curiosity, being open to new ideas, being open to trade, being open to learn from other people, to make old things in new ways, to make new things that you haven't ever seen before. So freedom and capitalism are not only institutions that arrive in certain geopolitical or geographic settings, but they're also a mindset. They're also a set of ideas. And that's extremely important to bear in mind. Bringing us back to today, we see this rise of anti-trade. We see the rise of authoritarian populism in Germany, in Sweden, in all of Europe, most of the world. There's an anti-globalization sentiment, in spite of the globalization being still very present, still very strong, and a force for good, in my opinion. And so the note that I want to end on, and the broader question here, is what gave rise, how is it possible that the culture and the ideas of liberalism could be created in Europe, and what are the reasons for its decline as of today? How do we counter that? I'm not sure that immigration is the sole answer. I think there's a larger cultural approach to invention, to liberalism, and to the evolution of cultures and technology, and also different worldviews to be had. So that's basically my first take on your speech. To summarize it, I would say ideas matter more than you said they do, and the main problem today is not that globalization is declining, but that the support for globalization in democratic ideals and liberal ideals are declining.
Okay. So if I understand your critique correctly, then, Caspian Rehbinder, is that, yes, it might be possible to defend free markets by restricting migration, but there's a real risk that by doing that, by losing the openness, that you also lose cultural components that are important in keeping freedom, economic freedom and capitalism? Or am I taking your argument too far?
I think you're taking it a bit too far. I don't even think that the immigration issue is all that important. I think it's you could make a good case. I think you do make a good case for restricting immigration. I don't agree with it, but there's a case to be made. But I think that misses the main goal of keeping liberalism and global capitalism alive. In order to do that, the objective should not be to restrict immigration, but to argue for the liberal values and the European ideals of pluralism, of tolerance, of invention, and of curiosity at a broader scale.
And is open borders part of it? I mean, for example, many people in Brussels would argue that, you know, you have the single market and you have freedom of movement, and they have to go hand in hand.
I think they're right to some extent. Then, of course, you have to discuss how far do you take it, and how far do you implement those ideas. I mean, in the perfect liberal world, there would be no borders and barely no taxes and completely restricted government in every single country. We are not there yet, and to remove all the taxes in a welfare state, for example, would be a bad idea, and removing all the obstacles to free movement just overnight would probably also be a really bad idea. However, I think the long-term goal of movement in between countries, for example, inside the European Union and inside the Schengen agreement area, but also to some extent third countries, making it possible for people from, for example, engineers from India to work in Sweden in IT and tech companies, just to take one example. Yeah.
So, Professor Erich Weede, would you like to respond to Caspian Rehbinder's comment on the importance of culture and Deirdre McCloskey, and etc.?
Yeah, let me first say a few words about globalization. I think here our disagreement sounds exaggerated to me. Of course, you are right that globalization, it has not yet been turned backward too much by Donald Trump and his peers. But the growth rate of trade compared to the growth rate of production has declined. And so there is a decrease in the growth rate of globalization. I think we can agree on that. And you said that, globalization did not yet lead to too much unemployment in Europe. You're right. One could even say, if you say it shortly and precisely, that globalization affects the kind of job more than the number of jobs, basically. And by and large, globalization means that you get more good jobs into your home economy and lose some of your bad jobs. So I think we can agree on the benefits of globalization, and we can agree on the fact that globalization is under threat. There might be some minor disagreements, but I think the longer we would talk about it, the more we would recognize that there are minor disagreements about the degree of threat and how much bad the threat to globalization has yet done. More serious is the disagreement about mindsets and a culture of capitalism. The fact that I did not mention the Mokyr-McCloskey argument about mindsets, or as Deirdre McCloskey says very vividly, habits of the lip is one of her favorite terms. The main reason why I did not mention that, in contrast to political disunity, is that I think political disunity is much more important, and here you side with Deirdre McCloskey and Mokyr more than with Jones and me, who put political disunity into the middle of the explanatory sketch. I would argue that the habits of the lip and the mindset and the culture of openness depends very much on limited government, which depends on political disunity and fragmentation. It's not only important for merchants and highly qualified people that they can escape from their rulers and high taxation. It's also important for dissidents and inventors and intellectuals that they can run away from their rulers. And so I think that a mindset of openness for new ideas, not only in economics but also in technology and in science, also depends very much on political fragmentation and disunity. And if I have to be short, then I cut what I would call the intervening variables of mindset and culture out. But of course, that I think that is not a phony disagreement. There is some substance in this disagreement. Concerning your next point, open borders, I think in my presentation, I only referred to mass migration from poor to rich countries. And of course, mass migration from poor to rich countries refers to migration of unqualified labor. You are right, you referred to Indian IT engineers. There are some poor countries, India certainly is a poor country. There are some poor countries which send qualified labor to more highly developed countries. And there can be no doubt that the export of Indian IT specialists to the United States has been beneficial to both countries, not only to the United States, which received highly qualified input into their industries, but it has also been beneficial for those Indians who stayed behind, because some Indians who went to the United States came back and became founders of the Indian IT industry. And so this economic interdependence was undoubtedly beneficial to the sending countries and to the country where they went. Here I would argue that by and large, qualified labor going from poor countries to rich countries is much less of a problem than unqualified labor. And you would not even need to argue that for very highly qualified labor, like IT engineers. You might even mention medical personnel from the Philippines, not doctors, but at a somewhat lower level of qualification, and them going to Western countries. It's usually again beneficial to both countries. But let me add here another heretical idea, and that is our politicians in all the Western countries make a difference between economic refugees and political refugees and discriminate in favor of political refugees. I think by and large, my suspicion is that in the interest of the receiving countries, it would be to discriminate the other way around. Because if your qualification is that you have been a dissident at home, a politically difficult person for the rulers, this does not say that you are likely to be qualified for a productive job in a more highly developed country. Whereas if your motivation is that you want to make more money, and that's why you go from your home country to a richer country, I think that's a motivation which is much more likely to make you succeed in the new country than if it's a political motivation. So I think the discrimination which our politicians make is they think too much of their own kind of people, which happen to be politically interested people. I must admit, I belong to that strange kind of beast too. But from the point of view of the interest of the receiving countries, I think we would be much better off if the migrants who come to our country were interested in making money in our countries, because that might be a useful, I'm tempted to say an honorable capitalist motivation, much more likely to make them succeed than if it's a political or religious motivation, which is acknowledged and accepted by our politicians. So I think here is a kind of split of interest between governing elites, which happen to be politically interested, and people at large, most of whom are, as public choice scholars would say, rationally ignorant and not interested in politics.
Professor, you talked about what you call the power transition going on between the United States and China. Would you say a bit more, please, about where does that leave Europe?
in the dust.
In the dust. Would
You see,
elaborate a bit on?
political disunity is a good thing from the point of view of limited government, but political disunity is not a good thing if you want to project power. You see, what is the European Union? The European Union is certainly not the beginning of a European great power. In the 1950s, there was some talk about the European defense community. But by now, we all know that a European defense community doesn't exist. Our politicians talk about it occasionally, but talk is cheap. Let me point to the most important barriers to a European defense community. The first barrier is, if Europe wanted to become a great power, Europe would have to be a nuclear power. There is no great power in the world without nuclear armaments. Of course, theoretically, one could imagine that the French share responsibility or transfer responsibility for their nuclear power, for their nuclear forces, to the European community. But the chances of this happening are close to zero. So we should forget about it. But there is a second obstacle to Europe becoming a great power. Most of the European countries, and I refer only to the big countries because they are the big taxpayers, especially I refer to Germany, which happens to have the biggest economy, and Germany is least ready to pay for defense. Essentially, German policy after World War II has been to make the Americans responsible for our defense and to pay as little as the Americans tolerate. Now, the Americans find it hard to tolerate German burden shedding as they did in the past. But since Germany is a democracy, and I expect it to remain a democracy for at least as long as I live, probably longer, I don't think that we will meet a 2% target, which we have agreed to, but we try to evade it, for example, by counting development aid. Maybe tomorrow we have the idea to count what we do for the climate or against climate change or whatever. So we are looking for new excuses for not increasing defense expenditure, and this is no way to become a great power. So I think we can forget about it, and the greatest obstacles are France, because of its nuclear forces, and Germany, because of its unreadiness to pay for defense. So Europe, from a power politics point of view, is in the dust, will remain in the dust, and wants to remain in the dust.
And what about European living standards? I mean, that's a measurement where we're doing pretty well.
Yes, we do.
Will we
do, and not wasting money for defense is good for living standards, no doubt about it. Unfortunately, the Americans don't want to remain our protectors and give us a free ride. And that's not nice from them, but I understand their point of view.
So your lecture was in many ways sort of a story of economic effects, or having sort of adverse political effect. So you talked about things that make us rich, for example, European disunity, which was great for the European economic miracle, but then it was the same thing that led to two world wars, so a bad political effect. And then it was a similar story about China. We export capitalist principles to the east, and that's been great for closing the gap between the rich and the poor in the world, but it is having an adverse political effect when we now have this power transition, which is very dangerous. Between the US and China. Would you talk a bit about, is there any way of managing these things? Things, good economic things then having an adverse political effect? Is there something we can do?
The only thing I can imagine is we have to try to contain protectionism and do everything we can in order to contain protectionism. I think this is the most dangerous idea in the world.
Can I just add to that? Because I completely agree that protectionism, and in a broader sense, I think it's not only protectionism and the aversion to free trade that is the problem, but if you look at the main anti-trade parties and politicians and movements around the world, it's the authoritarian populists of mostly Europe, also the United States, that are not only against free trade and the foundations of capitalism, basically, but also very much against the rule of law, very much against limited government. Many of these populists, there are the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, for example. There's Alternative für Deutschland. There are Lega and Marine Le Pen, and a lot of different examples of the same broad ideals that the people should have the complete power, meaning that the elected politicians that are elected by a majority should have complete power. There should be no judicial review. There should be no courts stopping laws. There should be no courts overturning a political decision. This is a much broader threat than only against free trade. I think this is a threat toward the very foundations of the European miracle that you were describing. It's a threat against the rule of law. It's a threat against private property. It's a threat against capitalism and free trade and globalization at large. Now, what do we do to counter this threat? And again, I think our differences on free movement are probably minor differences, and as on the state of globalization in the world today, as the longer we talk about it, the closer I suspect that we would get. But I still think that's not enough to explain the situation or to solve the threat. If you look at the emergence of populist parties, of these anti-immigrant authoritarian populists that are emerging, it seems not to be very strongly correlated to the number of immigrants. It's not very strongly correlated to the number of lost jobs in the region. It seems to be more of some kind of political entrepreneurship, failed politicians that are opposed and by new leaders that want to take on old problems with new words that threaten to overthrow the old regime, so to say, and this is, I believe, a much bigger threat and a much harder question to solve than just pointing out one simple solution, as in, for example, restricting the mass immigration of unskilled people from the third world. There, I see the largest threat to globalization, and the largest threat not only, as mentioned, not only to free trade, but to the foundations of the rule of law.
Professor Weede, would you like to respond?
I think here we have some kind of disagreement. You make the rule of law the center of your argument, and the reason why I find that difficult is that I think much depends on the substance of the law. whether the law is individualistic or collectivistic, whether it's bureaucratic and over-regulation or not. And because the label rule of law does not prevent, I'm tempted to say, the kind of Brussels rule of over-regulation. That's why I would hesitate to use it. Before, you used, by referring to McCloskey and Mokyr, you used the cultural variable, and now I'm tempted to do that myself in a different way. I think the threat to globalization is a cultural threat, and that depends on the difference, that refers to the difference between individualism and collectivism. And we have a kind of classical collectivism, which was enshrined in labor and social democratic parties everywhere in Western Europe. And now we have a new kind of collectivism, which refers to issues of identity, ethnicity, nations, or in the US, I would say, including even race. People find it hard to admit it, but I think it's at least behind the behavior of people. Collectivism comes naturally to most people. They identify with certain groups, and identifying with one group usually means keeping some distance to other groups. It's hard to identify with one without pointing to differences to other groups. And here I would argue that Western civilization differs from most other civilizations in being more individualistic than other civilizations. But this does not say that we are really individualistic. I think there is probably, from a capitalist and libertarian point of view, Western civilization is still too collectivistic. But it's hard to overcome it. And the reason why I'm skeptical of mass immigration into the safety net, because that's a kind of mass immigration which we observe in Western countries, and I think Sweden is not too different from Germany. Many immigrants will be in the safety net for a decade, which is in a long time, which is a very long time, and some will never get out of it. And I don't believe in integration by the social safety net. I think the only way for people to integrate is in the working place, in the world of labor. And I do think that mass immigration from less individualistic civilizations, and Muslim civilization is a civilization just outside, it's geographically the closest, and it's certainly a more collectivist civilization than ours. And that's why I think that mass immigration from a more collectivist civilization into a less collectivist, still too collectivist, but less collectivist civilization is likely to undermine limited government and individual liberty in our civilization, and is therefore dangerous. Here I would make a difference between various kinds of immigrants. By and large, more qualified immigrants, your Indian IT specialists, are more liberal than less qualified people, and it's easy to understand why. And so the more qualified are less of a threat to our civilization than less qualified people. And if I think, for example, of Vietnamese immigrants after the fall of Saigon, In those days, I was pro-immigrant. Now I'm more or less anti-immigrant. Why? Because I make a difference between different kinds of people, and I look at the probability that they will be integrated. The Vietnamese immigrants, whether they came directly to West Germany or as laborers into East Germany, they are a very well integrated community within Germany, and I know the same is true for Vietnamese refugees in the United States. Other groups of immigrants are much more of a problem, and I do think that concerning immigration, it's legitimate that we make a difference between groups of immigrants according to the probability that they will integrate and contribute, and or whether they will stay in the social safety net for a decade.
But didn't these things used to be said about most large immigrant groups? I mean, it wasn't long ago when people said that Catholics could never integrate in America. Now we don't have that discussion so much anymore, or at all.
That is true. People can change. And of course, if India would send its lower classes rather than IT engineers, I think there would be a kind of difference. So it depends on the difference between the home civilization and the receiving civilization, and it depends on the degree of qualification and the fit of qualification which people bring with themselves and what the receiving country needs. But I don't think that purely political or legal criteria help us very much. But unfortunately, too many politicians have a background in law, and I think they would do much less damage if they had a background, let's say, in economics or psychology.
So I know you want to come in, Caspian. I'm going to throw in one more aspect, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So the political implications of the argument that you made in your lecture was that we need to protect free trade, and therefore the thing that we can restrict is migration. So I would say that there is at least one political leader in Europe right now trying to do exactly that, and that will be Mr. Boris Johnson. Because that is, in many ways, the argument of the Brexiteers in Britain. Let's leave Europe so we can regain control over the border and decrease immigration, and let's then deregulate and become this free trading nation. That is what he's trying to do. So my question is, are you a Brexiteer, Professor?
From the point of view of German national interest, I think Brexit is a disaster for us. Because within the European Union, the British and the Hanse Group, organized by the Dutch, the Swedes, and a few other countries around the Baltic, were those who wanted, who always argued against protectionism, and they were reliable free traders. And that's why I regret the departure of Britain. And I think because the result of the referendum was very close. I think if Merkel had not opened the floodgates to immigration, to mass migration from a poor country, the result of the referendum might well have been different.
That's a fair point, yeah.
So I blame Merkel for Brexit.
Right.
I think she really was quite irresponsible in those days, and she should have known it. But I think she feared the bad pictures at the border if she had sealed the border. So it was really a short-sighted political decision, and I'm not at all a fan of her. Compared to her, I understand Boris Johnson. but I think he is wrong. He advertises free trade and global Britain. But I cannot imagine, if he succeeds and gets Brexit done, that the result will be a global free trading Singapore upon the Thames. I don't believe that. If it worked, I think it might be in the British national interest. But being a regular reader of The Economist, I cannot imagine this to happen. So I think Boris Johnson probably misleads himself. That's a capability of many politicians, and he's very good at that. And that's it's very difficult even to predict the result of the next election, whether Boris Johnson will get a majority. And I think by now, like many other European countries, there is more party political fragmentation in many countries, in Italy or Britain, in France or in Germany or in Spain. So in so many countries, I think even in Sweden, and I don't think that a kind of libertarian Britain is in the cards.
No, not in the cards. So
And the certain result of Brexit is that there will be new trade barriers between Britain and its largest market. And this is bad. And this is predictable with a degree of certainty. The other thing is hope in the clouds.